Hello everyone, and welcome to The Crown and the Sword. Today we're diving deep into the heart of the Middle Ages, a time of clashing steel, towering castles, and the eternal struggle for power between two great forces, the crown and the sword. But what does that really mean? The crown, symbolizing the king or queen, represented divine right, law, and the effort to build a unified, stable kingdom. The sword, on the other hand, was the emblem of the nobility, the powerful dukes, counts, and barons. These were the warlords whose power came not from a divine mandate, but from their lands, their armies, and their cold, hard steel. Throughout the medieval period, from the fall of Rome to the dawn of the Renaissance, this dynamic was the engine of history. It was a constant push and pull. A strong monarch would try to centralize power, create a national army, and establish a single system of justice for all. But the nobles, fierce and independent, would resist. They valued their autonomy, their right to wage private wars, and their traditional feudal privileges. Their loyalty to the king was often conditional, based on what they could gain. This tension wasn't just a political squabble. It shaped the lives of everyone, from the peasant tilling the fields to the merchant traveling the roads. Let's look at England after the Norman conquest in 1066. William the Conqueror was a powerful king, a classic sword who won his crown on the battlefield. He tried to impose a strong, centralized rule. He created the Domesday Book to catalogue every piece of property in his kingdom, a massive intelligence gathering operation to assert royal authority. Yet, for centuries after, his successors had to constantly battle their own barons. The most famous example? King John, forced by his rebellious nobles to sign the Magna Carta in 1215. This document, while often romanticized, was essentially a list of demands from powerful lords to limit the king's power. It was a victory for the sword over the crown, and it laid the groundwork for future concepts of limited government. Now, let's cross the channel to France. For a long time, the French king was incredibly weak. He was mockingly called the King of Paris, because his actual control barely extended beyond the city and its surroundings. The rest of France was a patchwork of powerful duchies like Normandy, Burgundy, and Aquitaine. The Duke of Burgundy, at his peak, was arguably more powerful than the King of France himself. He had his own army, his own court, and his own foreign policy. It took centuries of shrewd politics, strategic marriages, and outright war for the French crown to finally tame its powerful vassals and forge the nation of France we know today. The story of Joan of Arc is a perfect example of this struggle, a moment when national sentiment, inspired by a peasant girl, helped rally support for the French crown against both the English and their powerful Burgundian allies. So how did the crown eventually gain the upper hand? It wasn't a single event, but a slow, grinding process. One key factor was money. As trade in towns grew, kings could levy taxes and hire their own armies of mercenaries. This made them less reliant on the feudal levies of their nobles. A king with his own professional army didn't have to ask his barons for permission to go to war. He could just pay his soldiers and go. This was a game changer. Suddenly, the king's power was backed by cash, not just oaths of loyalty. Another crucial development was the rise of new technologies, particularly gunpowder. The stone walls of a baron's castle, which could hold out for months against a traditional siege, could be brought down in days by cannons. Castles were the ultimate symbol of the nobility's power and independence. Once they became vulnerable, the military advantage shifted decisively towards the monarch, who could afford the expensive new artillery. The age of the impregnable noble fortress was over. The sword's greatest defense was shattered by the crown's new weapon. We also have to consider the role of the church. The church was its own power player, with its own lands, laws, and ambitions. Sometimes it sided with the crown, anointing kings and giving them legitimacy. The idea of the divine right of kings was a powerful tool, suggesting that the king was chosen by God, and to rebel against him was to rebel against God himself. But other times, the church clashed with monarchs, as seen in the famous conflict between King Henry II of England and Archbishop Thomas Becket. And powerful nobles often had their own bishops and abbots in their pockets, using the church's influence for their own ends. The church was like a third player in this great game, sometimes a kingmaker, sometimes a spoiler. Then there was the law. Kings worked hard to establish royal courts and a unified legal system. If a peasant had a dispute with his lord, he could, in theory, appeal to the king's justice. This undermined the authority of the nobles, who traditionally held legal power over their own lands. By presenting himself as the ultimate dispenser of justice, the king built a direct relationship with his subjects, bypassing the feudal lords. It was a slow process, but every time a royal judge settled a case, it was a small victory for the crown's authority. People began to see themselves not just as subjects of their local duke or count, but as subjects of the king and part of a larger kingdom. But let's not paint the nobles as simple villains. Their world was one of honor, martial prowess, and lineage. They saw themselves as the protectors of their people, the rightful leaders of society. Their resistance to the king wasn't just about selfish greed. It was often about preserving a traditional way of life and a set of liberties they believed were ancient and sacred. The medieval world was deeply local. Your loyalty was to your lord, your village, your region. The idea of a distant, abstract nation was slow to form. The nobles represented this local, decentralized power structure. This great conflict also fueled some of the most iconic events of the Middle Ages. The Crusades, for instance, were a perfect outlet. Popes and kings could direct the violent energies of their warrior nobles outward, towards a common enemy, rather than having them fighting each other at home. It was a brilliant, if brutal, strategy. Send the swords away to fight in a holy war, and the crown can consolidate power in peace. Of course, it wasn't always that simple. Many nobles grew even richer and more powerful through crusading, bringing back wealth and new ideas from the East. By the late Middle Ages, the balance had decisively tipped. The rise of a middle class of merchants and bureaucrats who were loyal to the king, the devastating impact of the Black Death, which shook the old feudal order to its core, and the continuous development of state administration all strengthened the crown. Kings had standing armies, a civil service to collect taxes, and a growing sense of national identity to rally their people. The age of the over-mighty, independent baron was coming to a close. The sword was being sheathed, and the crown was finally secure on the monarch's head. The transition wasn't smooth, and it happened at different speeds in different places. The Holy Roman Empire, for example, remained a fractured collection of principalities right up until modern times. But in England, France, and Spain, powerful centralized monarchies emerged from the medieval crucible. This struggle between the crown and the sword, this long and often bloody contest for supremacy, is what forged the nations of Europe. It's a story of ambition, betrayal, war, and the slow, difficult birth of the modern state. Thanks so much for joining me on this journey through the medieval power struggle. It's a fascinating topic with endless stories to tell. If you enjoyed this video, please hit that like button, subscribe to The Crown and the Sword, and ring the bell so you don't miss our next adventure into the past. Let me know in the comments which medieval conflict you find most interesting. Until next time.